Cool, cool. I think this is live. We're going to find out. So today I am going to dig into section styles. That's kind of my goal. A lot of people were talking about it. This is a new feature coming in WordPress 6.6, section styles. It's maybe the next kind of cool, exciting thing apart from some of the other stuff we've talked about, block bindings, API, things like that. But just while I get set up, I'm just going to load up a few things and try to remind myself where to find the chat and see if there's any way I can keep track of that. Cool. So if you are here, say something in the chat. That would be super helpful. There we go. Comments. Okay, found it. All right. So let's talk about section styles. Section styles in WordPress are kind of a new concept, kind of old. I'm going to pull up a few different examples of things, and then I'm just going to show the process of making section styles because I actually needed to maybe create some section styles for this block theme that I use as for the basis of all my projects. So I kind of wanted to just do that live on this over the next like 20 or 30 minutes and talk about it. If you have questions, let me know. I'm just going to move my microphone closer because my Shure software thing is ignoring me. All right, so section styles, let's pull this up. If you haven't taken a look, this is the sort of document. Oh, let me add that here. Okay, if you haven't taken a look, this is sort of the documentation of section styles. You can find it on WordPress.org. It's basically a breakdown of what it is. One of the big things that's kind of exciting as part of this next release is they're really like cleaning up CSS specificity. So if you've had issues where you're trying to style things in the block editor and you're trying to override the core styles, or you're trying to have your block override another block, or those sorts of things, that's been a real pain point. This is clearing most of that up. The last sort of, I think, major issue that's really going to help people is getting out of this weird thing where, depending on what plugins you have active, there's like different versions of the block editor being loaded on different parts of your site or different sites and stuff. So I think that's the last kind of big change that'll help people. But this one right here, uniform CSS specificity, is really critical. If you don't know too much about it, I'll give like the very simple version, which is like when you style elements in CSS, if you style it based on the ID, the specificity is like really high. If you style it based on the class name, then if you style it based on just what the element is, that's that third number, that lowest. And CSS is always doing this like magic trick of like calculating which CSS to apply. And it's so much of a guessing game in WordPress, but these days it's going to get a lot better. So I'm excited about that. The second thing about this is this section styles like block variation thing. So that's what we're going to demo today. This section styles, it's basically a way to make styles for blocks or group of blocks like with much more power than before and much more ease. And the best part, at least to me, is this idea that you can use JSON partial files. So if you've built a block theme and you've ever been inside of Theme.json, it's like this massive file that could be like thousands of lines long. Not a huge fan of one giant file. I love lots of little tiny files for everything. So that's kind of part of the fun here. So that piece and the fact that you can style blocks inside of blocks and offer them as sort of curated design choices is super handy. So we'll go over this. I'm not going to go over any of the like PHP stuff, but we'll just create a couple block style variations. If you have any questions along the way and you want to talk about any of it, just throw it in the chat and I will try to pay attention to it. And I might try something different today, which is I might share my entire screen. So let me just move some stuff out of the way and move my streaming software over to the side. I'm going to try maybe sharing my entire screen and actually showing the full process from like literally setting up a site. So let's see how this goes. And maybe I should put do not disturb mode on just in case I get any question or any texts or anything like that. Cool. So I'm going to share. an entire monitor. Cool. Let me know if that's better, if it needs to be zoomed in, zoomed out, anything like that. Let me know. I'm going to pull up WordPress Studio, and I'm going to try using Studio as my example. And I'll say thank you to Fabian for noticing my green painted wall. I appreciated that so many people gave me design feedback on what color to paint my wall, and there were a lot of strong opinions about it. That was pretty handy. I don't know how do you make it go away now? Let's see if it just fades out. Oh, cool. So hopefully this all works out. All right, so let's start with just adding a new site. I'm just going to call the site Section Styles. This is WordPress Studio's like local environment tool. It's still a little bit glitchy to me, but it's pretty decent. I like it. That's how fast a site spins up. It's that kind of like lean playground version of a website that runs in like WebAssembly in your browser, kind of. So it's like the smaller like SQLite database, not the full database, that sort of stuff. It's a really nice kind of easy way to get going if you're just trying to mess around with sites. So I'm going to open up the terminal, and I'm definitely going to zoom this way in. So what's nice about Studio is it also comes with WP CLI, so I can do things like I can install a plugin. Let's see, like Query Monitor, and activate it, which I need to do. I can also update core to the latest version, which I need to do. I need to go to update core version equals 6.6 RC3, I think, because WP core update version and get this my local environment on the latest version of WordPress, because I need to kind of test out this is a WordPress 6.6 feature. Cool. And then let's go back into Studio, and then I should be able to just open the WP admin in this browser over here. Cool. And then, let me grab my theme. So let me just pull up. This is the block starter theme that my friend Aru and I kind of built, and we used really just for projects in general. So we're going to jump over to WP content / themes, and then we're going to clone the theme there. Cool. And then we're going to jump into block themes directory, and we'll open it in VS Code. And oh, cool, I can do this. Yes, nice. And I'll zoom VS Code in, and I'll close all the stuff here. Cool. So this is the theme. It really just needs an npm install because it does have some dependencies. Oh, you know what? It's probably going to get mad at me and make me start a new terminal. Cool. So we'll let that install. That's the build process for the theme. And we need to activate the theme. WP theme activate block theme. Let's see if that's correct. All right, cool. So that's our WordPress site. It's now switched over to this block theme. So this is just an empty block theme. You can use it to work on like development projects and stuff like that. The kind of high level benefits of this particular starter theme is that it doesn't include a bunch of stuff. It doesn't have a bunch of patterns. It doesn't have a bunch of things. It really just kind of turns stuff off and comes with really basic default styling, just enough to like have something in Theme.json to work with. And what it actually does is it kind of just matches the WordPress.org styles so that it's like not opinionated. It's the Garamond and Inter fonts and stuff like that, but that doesn't matter because you're going to override all of that anyway. So let's talk about section styles. So really, section styles are a way to style little individual blocks or groups of blocks and give like style presets. So we're just going to make a new page, and we're going to open up we're just going to call this demo and just save it so we have it saved. And in this theme, there's just one pattern, but I think it'll just kind of get the sense of what we want. So this is a pattern, pretty common pattern, a call to action, heading, text, button. It's actually a perfect example of what section styles are really good for, which is styling like little kind of like components like this, but not quite. And I'm going to talk about why I don't think components is the right word. But what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to make a grid. I'm going to make my grid wide and I'm going to give my grid like bigger columns. And then I'm going to move this group into the grid, and then I'm just going to like duplicate it 3 times. Cool. So we can see different versions of it. So the way block section styles work is the way you're going to see it most commonly used is it's going to be applied to like a group. But an example of just a block style in general is like if I click on a button and I go over to the styles tab and you see these automatic styles that show up here, like fill and outline, those are block styles and they're just like presets. So I could go in and I could manually change a bunch of this stuff. But personally, I just hate clicking around. I really don't like being in like this. I don't like doing any of this stuff. I don't like finding things in drop down menus and sliding skill range sliders. I'm glad it exists. I just don't personally like to do it. I feel like I just feel like dealing with all that is so time consuming. I don't know why somehow I've gotten to the place where writing in a CSS file or a JSON file just feels faster and easier and more maintainable. And the best part is it's already like in your code base, so you can version control it, you can sync it, you can deploy it to lots of sites, you can share things across multiple sites, across environments, you can see everything changes, what people have done. So what we're going to be doing is in the same way that if I select this outline button, you can see that the button changes its design, even though nothing in the sidebar changes. That's what block styles are and do. And the way they really work under the hood is they're just a class-based system. So all you're doing is adding a CSS class to that block and adding, CSS to change it. So it's really great because once you use a block style, you can change it in one place in your code and it'll affect everything across your site. So it's really maintainable because the block style itself is just a CSS class. And when the page gets rendered in the editor on the front end, it's always going to look for your updated CSS. Whereas when you're changing stuff in here, it's kind of tied into the content. And that's not the best way to handle things. It's really not as maintainable when you're just making all your changes inside this little sidebar here. Now, does section styles solve that problem 100%? No, and we'll talk about that. Does it solve it like 50%? Also probably a no, but it gets us a lot closer, and it's definitely a good first step. So what we're going to do is we have these 3 sections right here, and then let's just imagine we took one of them, and you can see when I added the pattern, the colors and the spacing were sort of set by default. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take out the colors. So you can see this group with no colors. And I'm going to actually do it to all of them because I think that's important here. Let's imagine we've added this content and we haven't added any styles at all. So just get rid of the colors. I'm just going to reset it down. This is like the default of our theme. It's a white background, it's black text, it's a blue button. That's just the default of our theme. There are only a couple of color options built into the theme, a dark blue and a light blue. Again, this is a base starter theme. It's meant for you to kind of like build off of. So it comes with very minimal amounts of stuff under the hood. So this is kind of what this default call to action little pattern, could look like, right? It's just matches the design of your site. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a block style so that we can have different color variations of this. Then when we start building out our site, and I've actually been doing this week for a client project where they have like 5 brand colors. They have this color text on this color background and this color background with this color text. And it's all these different variations. But once I made them as like little section styles, which took about 10 minutes, every time I was adding content for them or building out patterns, it's just, I didn't have to think about it because I had them already ready to go. And if they did ever want to tweak it and they said, man, everywhere we used the green, that white text just doesn't show, we need it to be black text. It's class-based. It's a style. I control it. I don't have to even think about it because I didn't go in here and like muck around with all these settings. So super handy. So let's make a block style. So I'm going to jump over to my code editor and we'll just kind of ignore all this stuff. I don't actually think I need a build process. I don't think we're going to do any CSS or JavaScript, but that is an option here. So let's just start with Theme.json as like kind of a example of where styles sort of exist. So when you look at Theme.json, the top level stuff you have available for it is you have a schema that is super handy because it gives us like autocomplete options inside of VS Code, and it sort of you can hover over things and it gives you the documentation for it. So super handy. If I type something that's wrong, it'll tell me that sort of stuff. So you have settings, you have styles, and you have template parts. And I believe there's some other stuff, but for right now, that's kind of the focus are settings and styles. And so settings are where you basically tell WordPress, yes, you're allowed to do this. No, you're not allowed to do this. Yes, please turn on fonts, but no, don't turn on duotone filters. It's just settings for WordPress when your theme is enabled. Then there's styles. And this is, I think, the most controversial part, which is the ability for you to define all of your styles like inside of a big JSON file. I hated it at first. I'm starting to kind of like it. It's weird, but it's just fast. You just make a change and it just works. Oh, that reminds me of one other thing before we continue. Since we're in development mode, we're going to set WP. Here, let me actually clear this out. WP config set, I think it's WP development mode to theme. Cool. So we're going to set the development mode of our site to theme. And basically that's just telling WordPress, hey, I'm developing a theme. Stop caching things, stop saving things. Let me see my updates in real time. It's super handy when you're working locally. Some local environments might do it by default, but I just added it as a WP config constant using WP CLI. So that way, as I make changes to theme.json, things don't get cached and stuff like that. Okay, so let's go back here. So in my theme, I do have that simple color palette that I showed you. The names of the colors are just background, foreground, which could be like text color, primary and secondary. WordPress doesn't care what you name colors, so that part is arbitrary. I'm not even sure if I like these names, but the point is that the colors have names. So anytime I reference a color, that's now also tied to a CSS variable. So what's great about that is all those CSS variables, I can change a color, and everything we're doing from this point forward is going to reference a variable, and we can change in one place, update globally. So again, when we talk about maintainability, we're all dealing with things that are CSS variables, CSS classes. Nothing's really hard coded here. Nothing's really like tied in a weird way. So super handy. I have some other things in here like the spacing sizes that use fluid kind of sizes. We have some font families, some font files, Garamond, Inter. And then we have our font sizes. And what's important here is really the slug of the font size. So I have them named by heading element. And this is because we get a lot of designers who give us design files and they are very liberal with their use of like headings and H2 and H4 and H3 and H whatever here. And semantically, I know that I don't want that to be an H4, but I know that they're thinking of it like that and they might be editing or adding content. So I will do it. I will name the fonts based on those values so that they can say, I need this to look more like an H6 and it can bring in the styles, but they don't. It's not the best way, but I think it kind of gets the job done. You can name your font sizes whatever you want. I think WordPress core uses t-shirt sizes by default, and I've definitely considered switching to it. The other thing you're going to see in this, which took me a little while to get used to, is that you can reference something in your theme.json in your styles with this kind of variable shorthand. So definitely seen a lot of complaints that WordPress spits out these variables and they look like this, like WP dash dash preset dash dash whatever. It's very long winded. There's reasons for the double hyphens. There's a method to this madness. But basically, if I want to take those colors that I just defined in my theme JSON, my presets, and I want the background or the foreground, I can use this shorthand. And what's going to happen on the front end, like I said, it's going to create CSS variables. So I'm only changing one thing in one place, and that's trickling out throughout the design system. So that's kind of a critical piece of understanding this is like the goal here is to create a design system. It's not to make this the fastest process ever for building a website. Okay. So in your theme.json, you have some root styles like color. There's some other ones. And then you could do spacing, typography, kind of just like the base styles of your site. And then under here, you could always traditionally add styles for specific blocks. And It's handy. I've been using it more. It's kind of nice for you to say, hey, I want certain blocks to look a certain way. But before you get there, like before you get to the place where you're styling blocks, you actually should be more interested in this elements area. Because what elements lets you style is just the baseline elements. So let's go back to here and look at our little pattern, our call to action. We have an H3, a heading, right? We have a paragraph and we have some buttons. And yes, those are blocks, but it's more helpful to think of them as basic HTML elements first and blocks second. And that's what Theme.json lets you do, is it lets you say, let me just style the button element. Let me just style an H1 element, an H2. Let me just style a heading element or a link element. And what's helpful there is, one, it's not tied to a specific block. So if a plugin wants to, it can opt into these styles very easily. Say you have a contact form plugin, technically they could add the element button class and get all those same styles, even though I don't think any of them will or are doing that. They could. That would be nice if they did. And with elements, because they're not blocks, like a block is not an element. A block is a weird thing. An element is HTML. And so say you want to style the links of, just a basic link, you can actually add hover styles. You can actually add typography styles, focus, like you can go pretty deep. And so with buttons in particular, it's super handy that you can design your button and design the hover and focus states. But again, you have to do this in theme.json. You can't actually do this, as far as I know, by like going into WordPress and like opening the style editor thing. Like that's not really an option. It's just an option in theme.json as of this point. And I think, like, for me personally, it's just easier to kind of work this way because Copilot auto completes things. These are all pretty like copy and pasteable because they're semantically like the same structure, even though they nest. There's a lot of autocomplete. There's tools like in VS Code. I know if you like command I, like if you're in here, I think if you like control space or something, like it gives you other options and fills it out for you. I think if you command shift O, you can start typing things like I want to find all the buttons. I want to find block gap anywhere that it is in here. I want to find my primary color. You can find like keys and values pretty easily. So a lot of advantages to JSON, even though I understand a lot of people would rather be doing this in CSS. And I can honestly say I don't disagree. Okay, so let's do some section styles. So let's add a new folder at the root of our block theme called styles. With block themes, WordPress is much more opinionated than it ever was before. You have to actually put things in certain folders, which I really appreciate. Coming from other development world, it would be really nice if WordPress was a little more opinionated like this. I think it's great that you can do anything anyway in WordPress, and that should never change. But it's nice when they give you some best practices. I think if they had been more consistent about naming your colors, naming your spacing from the beginning, I think we would have not been in some of the messes we're in now. Some of that, more opinionated consistency where you don't have to follow it, but if you do, there's benefits. There's some real value to that. And then I'm going to pull up Fabian's comment here. I still think that I would love section styles to allow me to redefine the value of variables. Yeah, I do have thoughts about that. So I'm going to come back to that when we build our first section style, because I think that's kind of important. Okay. Saving changes. I don't know. What did I change? Did I change something here? Okay. So I've made a new styles folder, and I'm going to call it, let's call it section light.json. So traditionally the styles folder was for creating entire like theme style variations where, say you load up the Ollie theme and they have like a blue version and a green version and a pink version. That's what the styles folder was for holding these variations for your entire theme. But now they've introduced, let me add variations for just like little sections of the site or blocks that pull from all these variables, these CSS variables. So if you change the color or the overall like theme design, the little sections are responding accordingly. So super handy. Let's just copy this, and there's kind of I'm not going to get into it, but there's a thing right now about whether you should be on version 2 or 3, WordPress 6.6 or not. Not a huge deal for this particular thing. Okay. So if I just filled this whole thing out, it would be a normal like alternate version of Theme.json that would change your entire theme design. But if I add this block types key, then what I'm saying is, no, this isn't for the whole theme. This is for one section. And we'll just say what block, and it's the core/group block, at least in this situation. All I'm saying is this is a set of section styles just for the group block. And once I do that, we need to give it a slug. That slug is essentially what's going to become the class name. So the way block styles work is your block, once it opts into a style, it's going to get a class that says is-style- whatever your slug is. So there's a lot of benefits to the class-based approach. One of them is that if you find that you can't do everything you want in this approach, you can still start with it and then just add your own CSS later because it's a class. So you can always just put CSS on top of it. Title, section length, that's good enough. All right. So let's start with some styles. So here's the thing about section styles. Oh, cool. It's going to give us, well, I don't want that because I want them to use the shortcode. So I'm starting with a light section. Now you'll notice this is a light section, right? Like I don't need it, but I actually think you do need it. I think it's actually super handy to have a light section because sometimes you will have elements where you want to explicitly say that it's a light section inside of maybe a larger section. So let's start with color. Let's just start with color for right now. So the section light, it's going to change the color to the background color of your site. So like the color area is, and the text to the foreground color of your site. And it's going to do this to any group you apply it to. And just to compare, we're going to add another one, and we're going to call this one, I'm just duplicating the file, and I'm calling this one section dark. And in section dark, we're just going to change the slug to dark, and we're just going to invert it. We're going to say the background is going to use the foreground color variable, and the foreground is going to use the background color variable. So this is what we're going to start with right here. So we have two different section styles, a light and a dark. And I've saved it. I'm going to come over here. I'm just going to save. I don't know if there was any changes, but I'm going to refresh the page. I'm going to pick my first, let's open this up so we can see. I'm going to pick my first one here. If I go over to my group styles, you can see now I have these two options, light and dark. When you hover over them, they give you this very weird preview where it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But I did see that Rich Tabor's working on a much better preview, and actually some other contributors are working together that shows you like a cooler preview. And then I think one day eventually these buttons are going to look much more like when you're switching your theme style variation and they show like the typography and the color and it's like a little card. I think we're going to see that eventually. But let's say this one, we're going to set it to the light one, so nothing should change. This one, we're going to set it to the dark section, so that should change. So now we have two different like card styles here, right? And what's great about this is now that it's saved, now that it's applied, I can continue to make changes to it. So for example, let's go into the light section, and let's move deeper and let's actually style particular elements. And we're going to style the button element, and we're going to add a color style. We're going to add a background color style. Yes, this is actually how these things are written. And what we're going to say is that in our light section, the background color of the button should be black, the foreground CSS variable. So now if I come over here, I don't have to do anything when I refresh the page. That button style now is automatically updated. So starting with my elements, I can kind of control the outermost element of the group right here. Then I can control the color of the text, the color of individual buttons inside. And what's even more important, if I do, let's just add a link to the sample page here. And let's add a link to whatever here. I can keep going further. So let's save this with links inside of it. I mean, that's not great, right? I have this link right here, and it's very hard to read dark blue, right? And then when I hover over it, it turns black. So that's a thing that I can continue to change. I can go to my dark section element and I can say, hey, make sure I have my comma. For my link element, let's change the color to be, let's change it to our secondary color. Well, I don't know if that's more accessible, but we'll find out. And on the link, let's change the hover state to have the primary color when you hover it, so it gets a little darker. So I can start building kind of the tree of how I want this design to go. Let's refresh it and take a look. And now you can see it's pulling in that like lighter color, and then it's darker in here when I hover over it. So there's a lot of value to just being able to kind of like nest your way down and build out these section styles. And it's super handy. So there's a few other things that I just want to kind of cover because I just want to give a kind of overall preview of it. If you have questions, just throw them in the chat. But I think I can see maybe the YouTube comments. I don't know if I can see other comments, but if you have any, let me know and I can share more stuff about it. There's a few other things you can do with these. They're calling them section styles because I think you're going to see them most often applied to groups like this. That's where they're really the most handy. I think the other place that they're the most handy is maybe buttons, but buttons are tricky, right? Because buttons, when you do these kind of section styles, you're styling the elements that are inside. Now, technically, you can actually style blocks inside too. So I can go in here and I can say, hey, if there is a like a list item block, right? I can say, hey, make sure that list item has this color, stuff like that. So you can get a little bit more granular, but it's honestly like not super helpful. It's just a little bit helpful. And where it starts to fall apart is, let's say I have this card here, and then let's just duplicate it. And let's say I want an outline button. Well, now there's a block variation inside of this other variation. The good news is that thanks to CSS specificity changes in WordPress, there's not really going to be a conflict. Like the outline, the the specificity of this CSS is going to override the larger group CSS, and that's super handy. And that's going to make things a lot easier. The downside is now what happens? Well, okay, I have a dark section and it has this button style. What if I have a dark section with a outline styled button inside? Well, I can't do anything about that. I can't change the style of one variation inside the style of another variation. And so that's why they're really great for these big section styles, but they start to fall apart when multiple things collide. That's kind of one key limitation. So you really have to be more curated. Now, am I going to make a section dark plus outline buttons as like a third style that kind of does this by default? Probably not. That's not going to be super handy. What would be more handy? I'll pull this comment back up from Fabian, which would be redesigning the value of variables. I think you'll see this in like Bricks Builder a lot, where in each little section, you would like in each component, you would make variables and then like alternate versions of each component. You could change those variables and all that sort of stuff. So like you can sort of do that, but it also then gets hard because now you're tracking all these variables. You have all this stuff to track. So there's a lot of limitations and I think a lot of like edges to kind of think about before we say this is like a great feature. But honestly, just the idea, like already I'm 100% using this on my next project, on 2 projects right now. Just the idea that like they have 4 or 5 different like color palettes, and I just want to be able to quickly add a new section and very quickly like assign this the style right here. And I'll give one more example of like one that I've actually been using. I'm going to duplicate a file. I'm going to call this heading dash fancy. So let's call this heading fancy and we'll call it fancy. So I'm going to make a new style and I'm going to apply it to paragraphs and headings. So those are the 2 different block types that can use my fancy heading style. I'm going to get rid of all this. And all it's going to do is it's going to update the font. And the font family, maybe I have a variable of a font family in my Theme.json, but maybe I don't, and I'm just going to make it cursive for right now because I don't have a fancy font. So what I'm doing here is I'm making a new section style, but really a block style. It's only going to work for paragraphs and headings. It's going to have this CSS class called isStyleHeadingFancy that we can add CSS to later if we want to, and it's just called fancy. So I've saved that. I'm going to refresh. What I also love about this is no build process. Things move pretty instantly. That's pretty handy. And now I can select any text, and it's going to have this fancy option that changes it to a cursive font. So these are the sorts of things that like I think are going to be super handy. There's a common pattern where you have a heading and right above it you have like a little tiny subhead, and maybe it's smaller font but it's darker and it has like wide letter spacing, and you see that kind of like above headings a lot. So you can make a little class for that, and then you can control it, and just to be able to set it in one click instead of like coming in here and making it part of your pattern, that sort of thing. So it's super handy. I think there's gonna be a lot of value for this. Then a question from Elliot, does a block setting override the section style? Yeah, so that's the thing, is that at the end of the day, the section styles are pretty flat in terms of their CSS specificity because you have the block, which is the group, and you have a class on it. So that's like the class, two class names tied together for this outer group. But if I come in to my heading and that's a block and I add a color to it, that's a block. That's two class names applied to this lower element. And so that will always take precedence. So it's really handy because you're never locking out the styles. Like it's always going to kind of parse them out, at least a lot better than it used to. So the section styles are like this layer, and this is like the next kind of layer on top of it. So it works really, really well. In terms of that, what I would love to see, and I'm sure we will see at some point in time, is I would love to see this little circle in the color like populated. Even though it's not set, I would love to see it populated because, for example, you can set like spacing, right? Like, so you have block spacing, like it shows nothing, but there is a value there, and it's a value set somewhere in JSON. So it's like machine readable, like parse it and stuff, and at least give me like a preview of what the real value is, because 0 is not the real value. And now it is 0, but there's no sort of like UI kind of like difference there. So that's, I know, a known issue. There's issues about getting that cleared up. And that will also kind of bring me to, so to answer your question, yes, you can override things pretty well inside the block. You can also get fancy and turn things off. You can also do things like content locking on your block patterns, right? So that, although I guess this is not quite content locking, but you can do things like locking stuff. So like things can't be moved and edited and stuff like that. And I have about 10 minutes left. Fabian says, I agree that for the color of sections, it is valuable and a cool feature. And I think that's about it. I think color and typography, it's really valuable. So I had an issue where I was trying to use it and I thought, well, I also want to change the block gap that comes in here, like the spacing. Like I want to control that globally also, because again, I don't want to be changing things in here. I want to change them globally with the class. Well, what's funny is that in here, you can see the spacing and you can see block gap and you can set it, but it does not work. So this you think it's going to do something, but it doesn't. Versus I was messing around with dimensions, because then I thought, okay, well, what if I gave it a minimum height? Because that's an option here, right? What if I want my cards to all have a minimum height? Like I want to make a hero section style. Here it says you can't use dimensions, but I did it and it worked. So there's definitely a lot of like things. And the answer that I've heard is that it's really right now meant for color and typography. And like I said, that's more than useful enough. You can always add your own custom CSS on top of it if you really wanted to. I'm still not sure what the best workflow is going to be for there. Fabian says, for the other examples you showed, I'm still worried that you cannot combine block styles. Every client I work with wants to combine different styles. So this is like, I was kind of thinking about this too. Like, let's say this was like a card style, but I also wanted, sometimes you have different, like card styles. Like maybe I want a fancy section, or maybe I want a section that moves everything sideways, like a horizontal section and stuff like that. Like I can't change that. I unless I just keep on making more and more unique section styles. And so the downside is that the core team has pretty much said like that's just not what they think this feature is for. So if you're waiting on this feature to let you choose more than one style or let you do it for like a more global component styling, they're sort of not like that just doesn't seem to be their priority, and they've made it pretty clear. So I'm not really sure where we go with that. And yeah, someone agrees. Since they're classes, they should be a checkbox more than a toggle. I mean, I personally agree. I would like to be able to toggle on multiple checkboxes. I mean, yeah, are you going to have conflicts? Maybe, sure, but that's a solvable problem. Um, but there's some other issues here too. So another issue is, let's say I want to change all the buttons to move over to the right like this. Technically that's a style. That's CSS. I'm not changing anything structurally or semantic about it. I'm just changing the CSS for the button. But because things like alignment and justification are not technically styles, you can't actually control them with a block style variation. So I can't come in later and say, oh, you know what, in our cards, we wanted all of the buttons to show up on the right instead of the center. That's just not going to be an option. I'm just going to reset that. Even though you think like, well, it's a CSS option. Now, technically, yes, it's CSS, so I could do it like manually. But again, it's like, I would like there to be like one way to do those sorts of things. And I'll agree with this comment that the risk is that if the CSS is poorly written, multiple classes might not work correctly together. Yeah. So like at the end of the day, there needs to be some sort of a overall thought out approach to how this is going to work. But I think a few things. Number one, I think this gets us a lot closer because, like I said already, I do really like this ability. I love being able to put things in smaller files. I love that this is maintainable and that I can make changes in the future, and I'm not stuck with the changes that I make. I like the idea that it's JSON, so we know it could eventually become more adaptable. We could start seeing things show up in the sidebar. You can actually assign a background image, so you could have a section style with a background image, like a texture or something like that, which would have really come in handy on some projects recently. So there's a lot of options there and a lot of power. But I just want to take the last few minutes and say that there's this, and then there's one other feature that seems like it would really, really help, which is synced patterns. Because at the end of the day, the content is here, right? This is the content. Stuff like what type of font is the design, color, font, I get it, spacing, I can control all those with my styles. But then there are certain things like this that are more about structure, even though technically that I think should also be a style. And those sorts of things are like structural changes that you might also want to make globally, right? I might want to say, oh, actually, going forward, we're going to try a new version of the card where, the button is whatever, it's on top of the paragraph, or the paragraph's on the top, or, I locked this. It's going to be some new version of this pattern. And that's what people keep saying about components. Like WordPress is finally bringing components with these partially synced patterns. And like, sort of, yes, that is sort of true. But because partially synced patterns cannot be added to themes, so no theme developers are going to be using them at all. There's going to be no theme developers using partially synced patterns at this point, and because you physically can't put them in themes. And then second, because some of the styles are here and some of them you have to do here, and some you can do with section styles, but section styles and patterns aren't the same thing. They're separate. So I could make a section style. I can make a section style and put it in my pattern, but that's not going to stop anyone else from using it anywhere else on the site in a different pattern. So they're not tied together. So there's still a lot of like flexibility and gray area. And like in true WordPress passion, it's amazing that we have flexibility and that we're not bound to like a single approach. But at a certain point, we will need to see partially synced patterns as like the layout, structure, semantics, and block style variations or section styles as CSS and stuff that belongs with a class. And we need to see those work together in a way where WordPress developers can have true components where they can rest assured that when something gets put into a WordPress site, they can change the design of it later. That's just the critical missing feature that I think a lot of developers are worried about, and that it can all be controlled in the themes file structure so that they can do things like have version control, test it out in different environments, those sorts of things. So I think we're going to see improvements. I saw that there's a GitHub issue for WordPress 6.7, and getting partially synced patterns into themes is on the list. And the idea that template parts, partially synced patterns, templates, patterns, they all have that same workflow where you can put them in your theme, you can override them locally, you can clear your overrides, those sorts of things. So I think we're going to see that get closer. And then they just really have to make up their mind about section styles, which is like either we control all the CSS or we don't. So you got to pick one. Because otherwise, this combined with patterns doesn't really solve those bigger problems. It just solves the problem of like getting your colors into your theme, into little subsections of your theme are super nice. Davis says, isn't it a little bit overwhelming when you need to jiggle and remember what parts I need to set in custom CSS and what in these style JSON files? Yes. So I will add that technically, you can also add a CSS string that's like, this is whatever. This is not real. This is like Copilot's bad example. But you can technically add CSS like that. I think you'd have to be a sociopath to want to write your CSS like this. But that's probably what I said about these JSON attributes, and here I am. So, but that is an option. And again, the other option is that this slug is a class name. So you can go in, like in this theme, we have a build process. We have CSS files for blocks. So I actually have like a group block CSS file that that enqueues directly to the group block, and you can say like dot is style, slug, whatever it is, and you can add that CSS. So like the CSS option is there. It's just that like, we just kind of want to have one consistent workflow, and you want everything in one place. You don't want to have to think, oh yeah, I had a CSS file for that, plus a JSON file, plus there was some settings I had to do in the editor at the same time. All of that just adds this, overhead. Decision fatigue is not super great. I have like 5 minutes left, so if you have any other questions, definitely throw them in the chat. I would love to be able to choose the section style applied to a synced pattern. Yep, I think that's like the final place we need to get, which is I would like to be able to make a partially synced pattern. I would like to be able to turn on which parts are editable, and I would like to be able to control the style of it in the same way using this sort of like JSON style approach. I think all of that working together, and the ability to do subcomponents where if I have this component here and yet my button has its own styles, I need to be able to control those. Like all of that stuff needs to work, whether it's through making CSS variables and renaming them, or just being able to come into your section. And then I think there's like you can add blocks. Whoops. You can add blocks. You can add a button. I don't know why. For some reason, my JSON is not like indenting all nice for me. You should now be able to do variations, right? And style the outline variation when it's inside the section variation, but you cannot. So in fact, all of this code right here, you can't do. You can't even do hover effects on variations. So there's a lot of these sort of missing pieces. And again, like I said, you can solve it all just by writing CSS, but we do want to move away from that if we're going to, or we don't. Another comment: if you don't style the subblocks or elements, isn't the section style the same as a variation if you choose to rely? Yeah, I mean, technically you could just put nothing in here, and like now you have a variation, and you can just write CSS, and you could do that here. I mean, you could just do that inside of Theme.json. You could register a block variation in PHP, in JavaScript. Not in JavaScript, in PHP. So there's lots of different other ways in JavaScript also. So you can do it and just write. You can do everything with CSS. Like that's the one thing that's nice. There's never a limit to the CSS you can apply to the block editor and to elements. That's always sort of an option that you can go down. There's nothing wrong with that. But it'll be nice when we do kind of have more parity of like, hey, if this is a CSS like class, let me control everything and see it show up in the editor and understand where these choices are being made. And finally, my other last feature request, which I'm hoping they'll consider, is in my styles folder. I would also just like to do the default styles for a block. So like instead of it being like a light section group, could I just do like a default and just do all my block styles as little separate JSON files? That would be amazing too. If you're listening, upvote that on GitHub. Okay, so I think that's kind of what I've seen with section style so far. I think overall, to quickly recap, they're really great for color and typography. That seems to be by design, or at least the sort of intentional scope of work for it. They will work for some other CSS or some other style things beyond color and typography. Like they work for background image and some dimensions, not others. I think they do work for border and radius as well. So you can kind of like, in your dark section, you can make the buttons outline by default and just do a border with a transparent background. Like those are all options you can definitely do. I think they're going to make a lot of things easier. I think if you look at any popular theme like Ollie or Rockbase or something, you could quickly see where like 5 section styles would probably have saved them from having to like come in here and click a bunch of colors a bunch of times. So definitely the value is there. And I think, I'm just curious to see where they go next. And I feel like WordPress 6.6 was a short release cycle. So at the end of the day, it's pretty impressive, everything they got in. And once again, I find myself saying, oh, I guess the next release is the one where I'll really use these features. Thank you again, Fabian, for doing it. And I will mention that I went to check on an issue about the partially synced patterns and about a lot of these. And Fabian had already written up a full GitHub issue explaining exactly what needs to happen. So that's already been written. Thank you. And Elliot has a question. I asked this question, but is it not possible to conditionally remove support if a style is chosen? Oh, that's my next thing I'm going to dig into is I kind of want to start getting rid of like a lot of this stuff, like get rid of color and typography options generally. And there is a new blog post on developer.wordpress.org/news where Nick does go through a lot of these options. And one of them was disabling, like I don't really need this stuff here. If I can control it in my JSON file, I don't really even want it to show up here. And there is a way, but it was server side, which I thought was weird because that's not helping us here. There is a way to do it in client side filters, restricting settings by block attributes. So it's just like, it looks like yes, this, but like there probably needs to be a real abstraction because you're not going to want to write this all yourself for every single block and every single setting. So like, yes, technically you can turn off a lot of these, although for some reason you cannot turn off font family, which I was really struggling with. But you can turn off a lot of these. But if you want to do it based on if they've picked a style or not, it seems like this would be a lot of work to like, even just checking what style variation is active at the moment is actually really hard and not shown here. Though I have seen some work on that. So I think the answer is yes, but like, man, this would be a lot of work to do. So hopefully that gets abstracted as part of it, or else if anybody has better ideas of how they're turning off a lot of these things, that's kind of my next area that I want to explore, and I'm definitely looking forward to it. All right. Thank you all for joining and watching. And if you have any questions about this, let me know. Did I do a good job of explaining what section styles are and the pros and cons? I hope so. If you're starting new themes for WordPress 6.6, I think they're definitely worth doing, at least for some light mode, dark mode, button styles, fancy headings, things like that. There's definitely some places to start with them. But no, they will not solve all our problems just yet. Thank you for joining.